Now we're going to take a look at the 22nd person to be president and the person who messes up my numbering system because they were also the 24th president, um, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland is very difficult to assess using these five criteria: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and of course the most important, to leave the country better or worse, because he had two separate presidencies with Harrison's presidency in between. So when you're evaluating Cleveland, it's very difficult to determine what was him, what was his interim, what was on Harrison, whether his decisions would have continued had Harrison not been in the middle, whether the outcomes would have been different had Harrison not been in the middle. It just makes things very complicated. And so I'm trying to evaluate all of this fairly, but I think this is one of those presidencies where there are going to be people who can easily debate where the blame should lie outside of Cleveland. In terms of growth, I'm not going to give him particularly good marks. Not just because of his complete disassembling of what little civil rights protections, the fact that Plessy v. Ferguson was on his watch, all of that, obviously with civil rights, he was a Democrat of that time, and Democrats of that time had no interest in the black vote. I think the only person who maintained office that was African American was Frederick Douglass, and then I think when Frederick Douglass resigned, he replaced that specific position with someone who was black, and there were no other political appointments that were black anymore. That just wasn't a thing that happened. The separate but equal segregation. I think Cleveland was a firm believer in the separation of races. There were many times where white supremacists were picked by him to do specific jobs, including Hawaii, which we'll get to later in terms of international politics. And I think that's a major strike against him. But that's not, I think, the only reason I wouldn't give him particularly high marks in terms of growth. His vetoes are often pointed to by his fans as him, exerting executive power and limiting government, but it also didn't seem to work in the long run. If the end of your term, when you're president for 8 of 12 years, is the largest financial collapse in the history of the country at the end of your term, maybe you can point to Harrison's 4-year period as being more causal because, again, it did happen right as Cleveland took office the second time. But some of the laws that were passed and lacked to be enforced, some of the people put in place, and also your second 4 years not remedying the problem, that does have to fall on you. And I know that may fall more to finances, but there was a major regression in the country economically. There were a lot of things done that caused long-term harm. Again, Plessy versus Ferguson on his watch. I think looking at all of that, you have to say that he did not grow the country. In terms of finances, there was a lot of fighting and there's a lot of debate even to this day over whether he should have done more with silver versus gold. All I can say is this. I don't think I'm necessarily going to blame him entirely for the Panic of 1893. I'm giving you spoilers for the next episode with Benjamin Harrison. I do think that was unfairly put on him initially because he took office, and I think it was less than a month after he took office, the stock market completely collapsed. He wasn't in power for the 4 years before. Some of the blame has to fall on the person who was in power prior to him coming in. He didn't magically make the stock market collapse just with his appearance. However, he also didn't help recover the stock market. He is famous for, during his first term, his vetoes being for things like pensions to Civil War soldiers. When there was a huge drought in Texas, he refused to send them seeds as replacement, even though the Congress passed it. This lack of investment will have long-term consequences whenever it happens. We see it over and over again. There is a period of basically pulling back, not taking care of things, not investing in infrastructure, not caring for people and systems effectively, that leads to financial collapse in the long run. How much of that is Harrison, how much of that is Cleveland is debatable, but I think the lack of recovery on a second term does definitely fall on Cleveland, and so I think that hits him majorly in terms of finances, putting him fairly low down. I would say we're in the Van Buren-ish range of just badly run. Even though the first term went well, if I'm going to give him credit for the first term and then not look at the second term and what he failed to do, I also could say that he inherited an economy that was growing and doing well in the first term. So again, I think the panic of 1893, the subsequent functional depression that followed, and then followed by a panic of 1896 with another collapse. All you can say that the panic of 1893 shouldn't be his to blame, but the lack of recovery over his entire second term, it is that does fall on his plate. International politics, I actually give him very good notes. This was a time of a lot of chaos going on all around the world, and even close, a lot of things we could have gotten entangled and embroiled in, and his wanting to not be imperial, I think was very, very helpful. We will see in upcoming presidents, and even with Harrison, who we'll have to circle back to, which is, again, the frustration of doing this is that we're going to be talking about things after the next president, but we are where we are. The fact that he disentangled us from the Hawaiian situation, even though we became re-entangled. Similarly, we didn't get hugely entangled in the Cuban situation, even though we would later get fully entangled. We stayed largely out of international politics and wars, but also expanded the scope of the Monroe Doctrine to now say it was the entire Western Hemisphere, not just the limited sphere of influence, which had been up to that point less focused on South America. Having a standoff over Venezuela, and having the political muscle to even win that standoff, to make it clear it's not worth the fight. I think you have to give credit to that. So I think in terms of international politics, I actually think he did a very good job. He's going to get high marks there. Again, sometimes I think we don't give enough credit when nothing bad happens. And in this instance, nothing bad happened. He did some things that I think were mistakes. Even if those mistakes were then reinstated after his presidency, he can't be blamed for that. I'm not sure where to put the Dawes Act, because again, with Native Americans, they're technically another country, the nation, and some of his Native American stuff was interesting. There were times where he honored treaties that his predecessors did not, and I think the Dawes Act probably had noble intention, even if it had horrible effects on the Native American community long term. The Dawes Act basically reestablished the law of the reservations so that rather than land being tribal, a lot of land became personal ownership of individual Native Americans. And this led to a massive sell-off of Native American lands. I believe it went from like 150 million acres to 77 million acres in a rapid amount of time because individuals who were destitute and in poverty began selling off Native American lands as it was no longer owned under tribal leadership. I don't know how much that can be blamed on him. I don't know. I have a lot of conflicting feelings about the Dawes Act. I do think it ended up not being beneficial to Native Americans, but I also wonder about the benefits of tribal ownership versus individual ownership generally. I've just got done doing a video on apartheid, which will be posted very soon. Well, by the time if you're watching this as public, it's been posted for months now. If you're watching this and you're a subscriber, it'll be posted probably the end of this week. And so maybe that's why I'm having trouble with the Dawes Act, is in my mind, I can see a lot of parallels to what happened in South Africa, where the using tribal ownership can negatively impact the value of the land and cause other problems. So that's something I wanted to mention, the Dawes Act, because I do think it's an incredibly consequential thing, but I honestly don't know how I feel about it being as a positive or a negative. In terms of war and security, again, internationally, I think he did a good job of avoiding conflicts, of avoiding getting entrenched in a lot of international issues that were going on. Didn't involve himself in the Cuban things. Again, internationally, I think he did fine. Internally, I think there's a lot of concerns that I have with regards to how he handled the railroad strike, specifically the use of federal troops. In contrast to prior administrations saying posse comitatus, this shouldn't involve the federal troops. I don't know how, again, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about this, because the strikes were problematic and they were causing huge issues economically at a time when we were in an economic depression. And so, on the one hand, I do think a response was needed, but the federal troops and the violence of the federal troops and the failure to manage this in such a way that we didn't have violence, I think that has to fall against him. And I kind of look at this as his do less approach left it to a point where when things got out of hand, there were less tools in his disposal, and that's part of why the reaction was the way that it was. So I think that's problematic. Did he leave the country better or worse? I think he left the country worse than he found it. I don't think he left it worse in a way like an Andrew Jackson or Martin Van Buren. I do think fundamentally there are things that were worse. Obviously, in terms of civil rights, the country was left in a worse space. I think his decision to veto so many things may have made sense from a budgetary point of view. And I can understand and sympathize with people who make the argument that he was for limited government and that the spending was out of hand and needed some limitations. But at the same time, I can't not notice that at the end of his term, when he had managed 8 of 12 years, we were in the worst financial collapse up to that point in American history. And he was so unpopular that his party didn't win re-election for, I think, another 16 years after he left office because he didn't meet the needs of the people. So, and again, the infrastructure thing, I also want to say, that included pulling out of things like the Nicaraguan Canal, like things that later on we know clearly would improve the economy. He wasn't in support of. So where does that leave him? I think he is clearly below, the Adams, the Rutherford B. Hayes area. And I think he's above Andrew Jackson. So that's going to put him at 14. So Grover Cleveland, his split presidency, right now is going to be 14th.